please take it over to the author's signing desk. And without further ado, I would love to invite our panel to the stage. If you could give them a very warm welcome. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Bright and early on a Sunday morning, so top marks to everybody for getting up and wiping away your sleep on this beautiful Jaipur morning. We're discussing Russia, literature, the love of travel to Russia, and history. Elif Batuman, wonderful book, The Possessed, humorful, very human, and very much a personal journey, as well as a literary journey. Orlando Figes, historian par excellence, written 4 books relating to Russia, Natasha's Dance being the very much the generic history. Just one literal health notice. Poor Elif is feeling extremely rotten this morning, and so if she collapses on stage at some point,
no mind.
Just ignore it, and we'll just continue and carry on. And I can't claim any literary work on Russia, but having been a foreign correspondent and bureau chief there for 7 or 8 years, predominantly in the late 80s and early mid-90s, witnessing all the extraordinary and wonderful events then, and in my view some of the political disappointments that have ensued since 2000. I hope we're going to have an interesting discussion on said subject. So let's really start with a general question to both of you. Orlando, maybe you can start. What took you to Russia? Why Russia? And what is it about Russia that makes people, irrespective of the politics, such an addict of the place?
I think it was the literature which I read as a teenage boy much too early that got me fascinated in it, but I didn't have any intention of studying Russia as a historian. In fact, when I was at Cambridge as an undergraduate, my main interest was German Jewish intellectual history, for which I'm much better fitted to study, I think. But I was advised by my supervisor, Norman Stone, who told me, you know, Orlando, I was planning to study a group of young Hegelians who might have influenced or might not have influenced Marx. And he said, look, Orlando, if you got trouble with your girlfriend or you're hungover in the morning, you don't want to battle with Hegel every morning. Suggested I do Russian peasants. If you're hungover, I suppose at least you can count Russian peasants and do something reasonable with your day's work. So I had no idea about Russia at all, other than through the literature. I think I'd met one Russian when I was an undergraduate. He was a mathematician. I was funnily enough living, and here's another strange coincidence, in the flat that Nabokov had lived in when he'd been in Cambridge. It's described in Speak Memory. And Norman, funnily enough, brought, in a very drunken state, this mathematician over to sort of lounge on my couch. And he didn't speak any English, but he knew Byron. Like a lot of Russians, he knew a lot of poetry, including Byron in English, although he only knew the meaning of Byron. I don't think he knew any other English language. And I had no Russian. And I was really embarrassed because I didn't know any Byron. And he...
You were well fitted out.
So we had this very odd conversation in which I would say something, you know, in polite conversation to him, and then he would answer with a Byron stanza, expecting me to answer, and couldn't understand why I couldn't, because, as we all know, every Russian or Soviet child in those years was brought up to know their Pushkin, and they knew a lot of Byron as well. And in a sense, so before even going to Russia, I was already introduced to this very deeply immersed high culture, which at some point took over a very large section of what we would call the Russian intelligentsia. mainly in the Soviet period, it must be said, but also, you know, as it had developed in the 19th century, it was high culture which really mattered. And that, I think, was what first sort of made me succumb to the fascination, endless fascination of Russia, the quality of its intellectual life and the seriousness of its intellectual life, and also the fact that you could have a lot of fun at the same time.
And briefly, before I turn to Elif, do you feel that quality of intellectual discourse, post-transition, has been able to sustain itself in this era of bling, or do you see it waning away? I mean, there's been such a brain drain, particularly in the sciences, but how do you see it in the world that you've inhabited?
Well, it's got thinner and older. It's got a bit more despondent, that old Russian intelligentsia. It's still there. They're not all driving cabs or setting up in pharmaceutical industries or running off to California to set up software companies, but they and even if they are still, I think, you know, quite capable and keen to talk about poetry in particular. You know, when I sit next to a Russian physicist, as I often do, you know, in a college eating hall or whatever, I find the quality of his conversation far more interesting on the whole than I would the quality of what we would call a Western intellectual. There's a sort of seriousness which I think has survived the painful transition. But I would also say that the sort of cultural tradition which I talk about in Natasha's dance, and which was so powerful to the Russian national identity, well through the Soviet period, doesn't really have the same pull. I don't think Russians can define themselves anymore by the strength of Tolstoy and Pushkin in the same way that they did only 20, 30 years ago.
And Elif, what about you? You came to it later in the early 2000s, the early part of the Putin era, but for you it was very much through the study of and the search for Russian literature, which you tell so brilliantly, amusingly, and presciently in your book. So talk us through that a bit.
Oh, thank you very much for the kind words. Yeah, my book is, I'm not a historian or a political scientist. I studied as a literary critic. I did a doctorate in comparative literature, and my major literature was Russian. And then in the end, I decided I didn't want to write an academic book or a history, but I wrote sort of a personal journey about insane things that happen to you when you study Russian literature. So that's what so to a certain extent, my book is about this very question. And when Orlando was talking, actually, several things that he said, in a way, what the book is about, it's not about, I mean, it is about Russian literature, but it's about obsession and about love and how random it is. I was taken by what you said about that the natural choice for you was German Jewish history. I don't know what exactly it is about your background that made that the rational choice, but I had a similar thing because I'm Turkish American. I grew up in America. My parents emigrated from Turkey when they were in medical school, and so in a way I grew up bilingual, so the obvious choice for me would be to study Turkish literature. And when I majored in literature, lots of people asked me why I didn't, and I write about this in the book. The reason is because I love the novel, and the Turkish literature does not have a strong novel tradition. My favorite novels were the Russian novels. And what I concluded is that love is a gift, and you don't get to choose its object. So it's kind of given to you by a chain of circumstances. And the chain of circumstances, as it happened for me, also in the author's lounge before this, we were facetiously talking about how we might answer this question, and Orlando mentioned a gorgeous apparition walking across the schoolyard, which
that was me.
To be, yeah, it was him.
Which I'll come to in a minute, if you're interested.
It was one of those novels where it all tied up in with the place we were at that moment. No, it was his Russian teacher, and I also had a crush on a Russian violin teacher. So I mean, these things, they're not trivial. They're, you have to live your life somehow. You're in some room somewhere, and something happens. I grew up in the United States during the Cold War, and we were always very aware of the Soviet Union as somewhere that was completely unknown, a total mystery, somewhere that's equivalent to the United States in every way. It's the only other, at that point, the only other superpower that was as it was also an acronym. It was also really huge. But everything that's good in America is bad in Russia, and everything that's good in Russia is bad in America. And nobody goes in and nobody comes out. And when they do, they're lying. And the other thing that resonated for me in what Orlando said was about the seriousness, because I grew up feeling like I was never good at having fun, and I felt that growing up in America, there was a tremendous pressure to have fun, to play frisbee, to go to barbecues, and to be a child. Childhood was valorized. And I had this feeling that, and what they would tell us was, you in America, you have real childhoods, you're so lucky, and little boys and girls in Russia and in Japan have to get up at 6 in the morning and memorize the periodic table of elements and practice the piano for 5 hours. And I thought, that's amazing, they're actually trying to accomplish something. So I was very envious of that, and that seriousness was something that I took with me through life.
What I like in the book are your depictions of sort of obsessive compulsives, which you do in a very funny in a funny way without resorting to mockery. So when you talk about the Tolstoy scholars and Yasna Polyana, in a way it's well,
it's because I am one. I mean, I'm just as obsessive compulsive as everyone who I talk about, and that's actually, I mean, when people doing a memoir, I actually wanted to do this book as a novel, and there's now in the United States a fetish of nonfiction writing, so everyone has to be writing a memoir. 28-year-olds have to write memoirs. I wanted to do, my book is called The Possessed. I wanted it to be, and I pitched it as it's going to be a retelling of Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Possessed, or The Demons, set in a Stanford-like comparative literature program in the early 2000s. They were like, no one is going to want to read that. This has to be a memoir. So of course, when it becomes a true story, all kinds of people come out of the woodwork afterwards and say, was this, how could you write this about me, and how could you write that? And what I always point out to them is that, however foolish they think that they came across, I've made myself look much more foolish.
And I know you've all been desperate to find out the secret, so I might as well just say. When I was 15, I was walking across the schoolyard, and I was having to choose my A-level subjects. This was in London. And there was this absolutely amazing apparition walks across the schoolyard, a new teacher. So I grabbed another teacher, and I asked him, I said, who's that? And he said, she's the new languages teacher. I said, what languages does she teach? He said, she teaches French. Oh, that's a bit boring. Everybody learns French, so I won't bother with that. She teaches Swedish. And I thought,
oh no, I got it wrong. That was your story.
That was what, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's what I was saying.
It's because I'm sick.
And I was saying, well, Swedish is a bit weird, and nobody really needs Swedish because all the Swedes speak English better than the English, so don't need to learn Swedish. Oh, and she teaches Russian as well. So I thought, right, I'm going to learn Russian. And ever since then I studied at university, became a journalist, and sort of spent 10, 15, 20 years obsessing about Russia. So whenever you hear scholars or journalists or writers or whatever who always said, yes, at the age of 7 I woke up, maybe you did, I woke up with Tolstoy, I woke up with Dostoevsky or Chekhov or anything else. I mean, for me, Lermontov was the hero of our time, is simply the greatest Russian 19th century novel, but we'll come to that. Anyway, it's not true. It was much more prosaic than that. So do you have any, what are your sort of prosaic Russian stories, Orlando, in terms of once after Norman Stone and after all of that, how did you actually get into researching history and take us on from where you were to the next stage?
Well, it was very complex, and when I started, it was 1983. I did a social science language laboratory course to get my Russian up. Which was terribly misleading because virtually all the social, scientific, and political words in Russian are imported Western words, socialisticheski, politicheski, yuridicheski, the whole lot. And so you get this false sense of security that you're speaking quite complicated, highfalutin Russian, but entirely with imported words. And in 1983, I went off my first scouting trip, and as it was in Kiev, and I knew a poet called Una Moritz, who's a wonderful poet, and put me in touch with a philosopher and his family in Kiev. And there I was rabbiting on about Hegel again and Marx, and doing very well, I thought, around his family kitchen table. Using all these words like socialisticheski, politicheski, yuridicheski, and then his wife said to me, in Russian, would you like some more sausage? And I was, I had no idea. But Basically, getting the language was terribly important. I did it in what one may call the intensive way, through a series of Russian girlfriends, and then went back and threw myself into the archives, which was a very difficult thing because the archives in those days were closed to foreign researchers. You could apply, I did. If you were lucky, which I was, you were put into a foreign reading room in the main archive of the October Revolution to study what I wanted to study, which was the peasants of the Middle Volga in the revolutionary years, which was seen as a rather obscure topic, but potentially quite dangerous because the peasants of the Middle Volga in the revolutionary period weren't all Bolshevik, and many of them took part in uprisings against the Bolsheviks. But I worked hard, and found myself getting increasingly frustrated because you could order one file at a time. My first file, I remember it was about 2 pages thick, and it was a report on deliveries from a collective farm for a 6-month period. And I thought, I'm not going to get very far with this. But you sit there pretending to work with it whilst trying to open doors and win favors from archivists that would get you more interesting material. But the problem with the archive was that the foreign readers were put into a separate reading room. Every application you made was through a KGB officer posing as an archivist. And then they would come back and usually say no. And the problem was you didn't have any access to the catalogues. As any historian or researcher will know, working in an archive without access to the catalogues is virtually impossible. So all you could do was work from the footnotes of published historians, because if you got your information from the footnote, they presumed it was okay to give you the file. So I started doing that, but the material wasn't very interesting. They wouldn't let us use the canteen in the archive complex because that's where the archivists and Soviet historians went to eat, so there might be fraternization, which would be dangerous. So I had to go and eat in a beer factory next door. But eventually I found the chink in the system, which was in the complex there was only one toilet. And I was a smoker in those days, and it was the only place you could smoke in the archive. So I went with my Marlboro cigarettes, and I would start chatting up and offering cigarettes to Soviet historians and archivists who would give me the numbers.
What, in return for Marlboro?
No, they would give me the numbers of the files I needed. I'd say, I want the village Soviet records for this region for these years. And they say, I'll bring you the numbers tomorrow. And they would bring me the archive numbers, and then you could order it. And the archive system worked in a way that they didn't destroy material. They kept everything. It's a bureaucratic system, but they just limited access to it. But the means of limiting access was to limit access to the catalogue and the numbers. But if you had the numbers, they thought, well, you must have got them from a legitimate means, we'll give them to you. So it was a little bit like espionage, I suppose, in a way.
And Elif, in the time that you were looking at Russian literature in Russia, or in the former Soviet Union, in Samarkand, in Yasna Polyana, in St. Petersburg, whatever, how did you find your collaboration with Russians and with locals? How helpful were they to you in your endeavors?
Excuse me. Well, I actually never did archival work abroad. The times that I went abroad, Samarkand, by a bureaucratic accident, I ended up spending 8 weeks studying the language and literature of Uzbekistan, which had nothing to do with anything. Well, it's a long story. Anyway, and then when I went to Yasna Polyana, that was for a conference, and Petersburg was to research in palace made out of ice that was a replica of a palace that Empress Anna Yanovna made in the 18th century. But I did do archival work at Stanford, which could not have been more different from asking for numbers in the toilets of the KGB monitor. And there I was working on I was curating, helping to co-curate an exhibit about Isaac Babel, who's a Russian, Soviet, Jewish short story writer. He writes these very brilliant, mysterious short stories. He was murdered by the KGB in 1940 or 41. And the thing that I was looking for in the archive was in his diary, he mentions, one of his famous short story cycles is the Red Cavalry cycle, which is about his experiences as a propaganda officer in the Red Army during the Russian Civil War in 1920. And he describes his conversation with an American pilot who was fighting on the Polish side and was shot down behind enemy lines, and Babel had to interrogate him because he was the one who knew foreign languages. And he mentions that this guy's name was Marion Cooper. And Marion Cooper is the guy who came up with the story for King Kong. That's his original story. So, and his papers turned out to be in the Stanford archive. So we spent a certain amount of time trying to dig those up, and we came up with this theory that King Kong was actually based on Cooper's view of the Cossacks, and also of evolutionary theory that was going on then about the Cossacks being from a sort of prehistoric, primal period of human history, which then we tried to put in the exhibit, and we were told that it would be offensive to Cossacks. And I said, well, there probably won't be any Cossacks at the exhibit, and they said, well, in California, you never know.
And in your trips to Russia, in that period, were you able, I know it wasn't the theme of the book, but were you able to form views about the way the country was developing, its interaction with the rest of the world? This was the period when, I mean, I saw to myself, I had a bizarre 4.5 hours late one night with Putin in 2004. This was the weekend straight after the massacre at the school in Beslan. And I really got a sense then of him turning and becoming increasingly angry, and a sense of sort of betrayal by the West, particularly the United States. But did you get a sense around that time of your travels of how did you feel about the way people interacted with you, and how did you, what opinion did you form of the country?
Well, the first time I went was for 3 months as a junior semester abroad in 1998. So that was sort of the end of the comic, ludicrous, Balzac-like end of Yeltsin, where he was this sort of somewhat comic figure. But there was also a huge amount of money in Moscow, and it wasn't really clear what was going to become of it. I was studying at this kind of corrupt program, which was really, really cheap. That's why I signed up for it. And it would give students, and it had some affiliation with the University of Kansas, so it was almost everyone except for me and a couple other people were from Kansas. And all of these Kansas people got internships in the Duma, which I don't know what on earth they could have been doing there. Chubais came and talked to us. It reminds me of, actually, I'm living in Istanbul now, and the amount of money and excitement and uncertainty and flux really is similar. And then the next time I went, when I was really interacting with, I mean, Yasnaya Polyana, I'm not counting Tolstoy's house because it's a little bubble of paradise and scholarly concern. But when I went to see the rebuilding of the Ice Palace, there was this sense that, you know, one of the questions, I was writing about this for the New Yorker magazine, and one of the questions that I was asking was why in 2006 rebuild Ice Palace from 1740? And the reason the original Ice Palace was built was by this empress who was Peter the Great's niece, and her main thing in life was entertainment. She loved being entertained, and she built this palace as a torture device for her jesters. She wanted them to sleep in she had these jesters who were, some people thought they were midgets, which they weren't, but anyway, she wanted them to spend the night in the Ice Palace, and they almost froze to death. And the answer that I got from people about why now was, well, it's Putin. He's the next Anna Yanovna. We're now living the tyranny of entertainments, which I thought was kind of an interesting.
That's a very interesting phrase. Orlando, what about you? I mean, we're going to talk this evening about your latest work, which a very moving exchange of letters from the Gulag times. But what's your view about the way Russia has developed over the last 10 years or so, particularly through the work that you have done through your books?
I'm pretty pessimistic, really. The perestroika years, to some extent the early Yeltsin years, were an opportunity for Russians to confront their very painful history. And although that's not something they're barred from doing in any way now, it's not something they're encouraged to do either, because the mass media, largely under the control of the state, simply marginalizes the collective memory of the Soviet, well, of the Stalin years, the darker aspects of the Stalin years, and indeed looks to take something positive from the Soviet legacy, in particular Stalin's industrialization, which Putin recently claimed should be a model for Russia's economic future. I'm not sure if he meant by use of the Gulag or not, since the Gulag was so central to Stalinist industrialization. But also the war effort is something that the Russians should take pride from. So it's a complicated situation now that so much of Russian national identity is situated, or at least to some extent rooted, in the Soviet period, that it's hard for post-Soviet Russians to disentangle themselves from it, especially whilst people are still alive who do take pride from what they contributed to in the Soviet period, the victory in the war and so on. And that's something which is, I think, uniquely a problem for the Russians in a post-Soviet context, insofar as, you know, in the Baltic or in Georgia, they can build museums of totalitarianism in which the Russian Revolution, and it really is the Russian Revolution, is portrayed as a sort of foreign imposition from which they have liberated themselves. And Russophobia can be very much, and has very much been, a part of post-Soviet nation building since 1991 in the non-Russian parts of the former Soviet Union. But for the Russians, they can't do that because it was the Russian Revolution, even if one might argue actually it was the Latvian riflemen who made the decisive difference. But also because so much of their own identity is entangled in what happened in the Soviet period, and they keep getting reminded of it. So, you know, the sort of trends that I talked about in the 19th century, in terms of how Russians, through their literature and their arts, came to understand themselves, how they came to understand their own sensibility, their own modes of behavior and dress, how far they came to understand how far they were Europeans, or whether their European manners and attitudes and languages were merely imposed upon them, or something that they had made Russian in some form, and how far they were really having more in common with their peasant nannies and serfs, whose folk culture had very little to do with Europe perhaps, which perhaps had much more to do with Eurasia. When they started to even think, well, perhaps some of our folk tales come from India. Perhaps we have more in common with the Central Asians than we do with the French, although for 100 years the Russians in high society worshipped at the altar of French civilization. All of those questions of the 19th century have sort of been filtered out, I suppose, because now the Russian national identity is so invested in what Russia did as the leading nation or republic of a Soviet empire. So the post-imperial malaise that Russia feels now, the sense of resentment at its loss of superpower status, the insecurity it feels in the world, the paranoia of Russian governments about its borders and security, all of that is, I think, a post-Soviet legacy, which can no longer be helped in the way that we might want it to be by the confidence it can gain from the traditions that I charted in Natasha's dance.
And none of it helped in the early mid-90s by the behavior of so many thinkers, analysts, advisors from the West. I mean, I was witness to both the wonderful moments of 91 and the Russian democratization protests, the opening up, literally the opening up of a country. So many parts of the country that were closed, not just to foreigners, but to Russian citizens themselves. That sense of being able to explore physically and also explore intellectually and cerebrally things that were denied for so long. But the extent to which this was mistaken for and I saw it in the behavior of Western advisors in the finance ministry, in the economics ministry. This was as sort of Westernization, pure and simple, sort of you can become like us, and almost a wiping out of Russian history, the good as well as all the worst manifestations of Soviet life.
Yes,
that was such a historic
hate relationship, and ambivalence about Russia's European status and identity. I mean, Putin often talks about wanting respect from Russia, from Europe. And there is this strong desire, but also a deep sense of resentment which fuels Russian nationalism to a large degree, that the Europeans have a double standard towards Russia. I wrote a book on the Crimean War, and I think this was a very powerful motive for the Russians in provoking war and in the end being prepared to fight it. Pagodin, the great pan-Slav ideologist who had the ear of Nicholas I, who caused the Crimean War, wrote this long memorandum about European relations in which we have the Tsar's marginalia. And they're very interesting because Pagodin would say things like, he's writing in the 1840s, it's all very well for the French to occupy the Vatican. It's all very well for the British to invade India and conquer half the world, and that is their natural right, no one says a thing. But when the Russians try to defend their co-religionists in the Holy Lands or in the Balkans, everyone's up in arms. Why should it be this way? And this sort of sense of a double standard being imposed on the Russians is very powerfully felt still and does fuel Russian nationalism. It's no accident, I think, that Nicholas I's portrait hangs in the antechamber of the presidential offices of the Kremlin. He's seen as a hero in Russia now, as someone who stood up for Russian interests against the West. So in that sense, this love-hate thing is ambivalence. You know, Russia is a sort of culture or civilization which sits on the Eurasian steppe, but with its back to the East. Wants to be accepted by the West, but when it feels rejected, is happy to turn the face eastward and sort of embrace its Scythian or Turanian culture, almost as a sort of way holding up the fist as a threat to the West.
And just as we start taking questions, I'm particularly interested in Indian perspectives of Russian literature, Russian life, Russian politics, travel to Russia. But I was just reminded of the special relationship between India and the Soviet Union as it was then when I was visiting the Indira Gandhi Memorial Museum in New Delhi only last week, and just the extent of being reminded, which I needed reminding of, India leading the non-aligned movement, and Gandhi and all India leaders from Nehru very much having a particular relationship with the Soviet Union, and now as the two countries sharing BRIC status, for what that's worth. Again, a sense of how India relates to modern capitalist Russia that's still struggling to identify its place in the world, would also be fascinating to hear, but also pose your questions to either of our two authors on either side of me. So who'd like to go first?
A gentleman up here?
Yep, up there, and on this side. Was there a question here at the front?
There's one right there.
Sir?
Right, yeah, there, yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you think that after the revolution, there is a vacuum in Russian literature, considering, the legacy of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Gorky?
Who wants to? Who are the modern day?
I'm not sure I got the question.
Is
Who
there
are
now
the
a gap in modern in the great modern Russian?
Well, one reason I'm here at the festival is I was a judge for the 2013 International Man Booker Prize, and we have one Russian writer who we're very happy with, which is Vladimir Sorokin. He's super interesting. So there are good writers. It's hard to say that. I don't feel that there's anyone who I would, throw myself into the same way as with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but it's hard to judge those things without some kind of historical period.
Well, I would certainly commend you, even though he lives in Kiev, and he has Ukrainian citizenship. He is ethnically Russian. Andrei Kurkov, his novel Death and the Penguin, is the closest thing to a modern-day Master and Margarita. It's an astonishing piece of work.
Yeah, and try Victor Pelevin too. I mean, so there are writers. I mean, I think it's a hard act to follow Tolstoy and Dostoevsky.
Yeah, not many anywhere in the world.
Well, and they're shorter. I mean, they're doing a different thing now, right? They're like Petrushevskaya. There are all these.
They're almost kicking against that tradition.
Yeah, they are.
And so they should, because you can't constantly try and write in the shadow of these giants.
Second question was there. Yeah, if you could stand up when you ask your question, and then after you, the gentleman there
in the middle.
in the aisle
no problem.
there. Thanks.
Thank you for very interesting. I myself got deeply moved when I read the Gulag Archipelago, and I just wonder, not particularly just Solzhenitsyn, but how is within literature in Russia today? How is that? Is it dealt with? Is it? How does it crop up that type of history in the literature of Russia today? What do you think?
I think a slightly abridged version of Gulag Archipelago is now mandatory reading in secondary schools. Putin did introduce that reform last year, shortly after Solzhenitsyn's death. And Putin was a big fan of Solzhenitsyn, I think largely because of Solzhenitsyn's nationalism. Otherwise, it has to be said that, you know, there's a real issue with how the Gulag and the terror are dealt with in textbooks. If you go into the average secondary school in a provincial town, the Russian history textbook will look much as it looked in the early 1980s. And there'll be a small section on the terror, mainly focusing on the sort of Khrushchevian version of it as something that affected mainly the party elites, and then maybe a word or two about it spread into the masses. And then they'll move on to the 1936 Constitution or something. So it really is marginalized. It really is marginalized. And textbooks which have tried to open it up using Western pedagogic methods with introduction of sources, or the really subversive thing would be, and some textbooks have been banned for this, comparing the terror and the Gulag to the experience of the German camps. That gets you into trouble quite quickly. So it's not censorship. You can go to bookshops and buy books like Conquest and others about the terror and the Gulag, and Yevgenia Ginsburg and Nadezhda Manjtam. All of these testimonies about the Gulag are available, but it's not in any way promoted as something that needs to be part of the collective memory.
And I would just add to that, the sort of opening and closing of the tap is quite sort of, it's quite spasmodic, it's quite mercurial. It was only a year or so ago that State TV devoted prime time to a documentary film that had been long suppressed on the Cuisine massacre. That was shortly, I think, before Putin was going to Poland, and there was a need to improve things. But there isn't necessarily, there's, you know, to coin Lenin's phrase, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or more likely, you know, 1 forward, 2 back at the moment in terms of opening things up, certainly in terms of historical research. There's a gentleman there in the aisle, and then we'll come to the lady there afterwards. Yeah, so you go first and then here.
Thank you. Despite having one of the longest coastlines in the world, Russia is practically a landlocked country compared to the Western European countries and the United States. And despite having conquered Siberia in the 18th and 19th century, do you think Russia becoming a superpower was a historical mistake, and now they are holding on to it? It was never meant to be a superpower like the United States can be. Thank you.
Go on, Elif, you can give that a go.
Oh, I'm not sure what it means. There's a lot of historical determinism in that question that I'm not sure how to address. Should it have become a superpower? Maybe that's more in your field.
Well, did it become a superpower by mistake?
Oh, I'm not going to let you get off with that too lightly, but I'll come back.
Well, I'll have a go. No, I share Elif's reservations about it, but I think the problem, you're right in a sense, it is landlocked, and also the problem of Russia is its geography is skewed, because it's got this narrow little access through the Baltic, which the Swedes control, and then the Germans, and then the British can blockade it, as they did on several occasions. And then they got this Black Sea, and that's very problematic, because the Ottomans are powerful, and because there's this narrow little channel to get into the Mediterranean, and because it's, you know, as soon as a foreign fleet, the British have the most powerful fleets in the 19th century, obviously, and they're helping the Ottomans. But so instead of it being an open channel to the sea to make them powerful, it's actually a very vulnerable, soft underbelly. And the Crimean War proves that, because as soon as it starts, the British and the French and the Ottomans, they all come in through the Black Sea. They can arm the Muslim insurgents in the Caucasus. They can get foodstuffs from London and Paris to the Crimea quicker by sea, all coming all the way around through the Mediterranean, than the Russians can get their foodstuffs and soldiers by by carts on muddy roads from, you know, even southern Russia. So this huge military imperial advantage is actually their great vulnerability. And then as a result of the Crimean War, yeah, they then look into Central Asia, and they then push much more persistently into Siberia. And it's only ever weakly held. It isn't really a superpower status. Their superpower status really only comes as a result of Stalinist industrialization. Let's be realistic about it. Because they were a big army in the First World War, but they were not really in a very effective one. And so, you know, it's not the Black Sea that matters so much, it's the White Sea. It's the access to all those precious resources, nickel, platinum, gold, the Kolyma minefields. I come back to it, it's the gulag that makes Soviet Union a superpower.
Right, we'll go there, and then here in the front row. Yep.
Hi, I haven't been exposed to too much Russian literature, but I'm interested in it, and I wanted to know the extent to which Russian folk tales are represented in current Russian literature. I mean, in literature about Russia, and is it still relevant?
Yeah, one of the most exciting contemporary writers is, is she Ludmila Petrushevskaya? Ludmila Petrushevskaya, who does modern day fairy tales, and they're very much based on the older fairy tales. There's also, I think, a 19th century writer, Leskov, he's just been retranslated and reissued, and he's someone who wrote the traditional, he wrote in the style of traditional folk tales, but he wrote literary stories rather than actual found tales. So yeah, I think the folk tradition, and that's a lot of what Natasha's dance is about. There's this whole kind of, which actually kind of made me think about the superpower question too, because then I was thinking about the Crimean War and feeling sorry about Turkey and with its beautiful coastline and its wretched.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in Turkey somewhere.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't want to be super cheesy, but Russia has an incredible national idea, and so does America, and Turkey just does not. The Ottoman Empire didn't have that. I don't know. I think there's something there. But,
yeah. Folk tales make their way not only into Russian literature, but of course into Russian opera and music. So a lot of operas are based on folk tales.
Yeah.
And it's also incredibly important for the development of the Russian literary language, because writers like Leskov, Lermontov, Nekrasov, they're all trying to write in an. You see, the language of literature circa 1812 was a funny hybrid of Church Slavonic bureaucraties, and then a lot of Russian words, but many more which were neologisms or Gallicisms, inventions imported from French words. And they wanted, being Democrats, wanting to make a sort of cultural bridge to link them with the common people, they had to find a way of writing language in prostoreche, in simple spoken Russian. And so they would take not only ideas from folktales, but idioms and expressions, and try and infuse that in their literature. And so in that sense, it's actually, in many ways, for poetry too, it's like the folk language and the folk tale and the folk imagination is the bedrock of Russian culture as reinvented in a more national hue by writers and artists and composers in the 19th century.
We've got time for a couple more questions. The gentleman here in the front row, and then the guy there in the white shirt there in the aisle.
Yeah, good morning. My question is, these 19th century giants and 19th century literature, you talked about the break post that accompanied the Soviet era. in today's Russia, how popular are these 19th century writers and giants?
I actually haven't been there recently, but I imagine when I was there, they were hugely popular. You still had to memorize enormous amounts of Pushkin as a child. And actually, I mean, when I would go there and try to talk about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, a lot of people who weren't, hadn't gone out of their way to study it really didn't want to talk about it simply because it had been forced on them as children for years. And they read, I think, War and Peace. People my age read War and Peace as required reading when they were 12, which is really too early, and they had a horrible time, and it was a trauma that stays with them their whole life,
I agree with Elif. I mean, I think perhaps it's becoming less popular as just the economics of pumping out those sort of multi-volume series of the works of Tolstoy, which I think as you put in your book, there's over 100 volumes.
Yeah.
You weighed
pounds,
it, didn't you?
100 pounds, yeah.
So I think that just the markets of publishing don't allow for mass dissemination of the classics anymore. And I think also, as Elif says, I mean, there's a turning away from all of that. It's the tired, forced culture of their parents. They're probably more interested, if they are interested in reading anymore, in reading imported literature.
It is interesting that every single book you can think of, like any book you can think of in Russian, is there for free on the internet.
Yeah.
It's astounding.
Yeah, the whole e-books thing is very strong. But I would slightly disagree with panelists. I mean, the 19th century, the revival of Russianness of the 19th century is a safe domain to be the sort of the latter part of the imperial era, and you see it in the revival of that era's cuisine. There's a lot of Russian cooking, a lot of revival of dishes, particularly fish dishes from that era. It's very sort of fashionable, having absorbed the sort of hyper-Westernization of the early part of the transition. This is the mildly positive side of what is happening now, a sort of slightly feeling.
This is just what's happening in Turkey, and it's very sinister. I've been living in Turkey for the past 2 years, and there's this thing called Ottomania, which is this resurrecting this Ottoman culture that actually never even really existed.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. There's the restaurants, serving Ottoman cuisine, which has been invented by some people based on nothing. There's a huge, the most popular Turkish soap opera is about the court of Süleyman, and it's all tied with this. I mean, the Islamist government. It's about what you said about turning your back on the West because feeling rejected.
I'm not sure it has to be sinister. And in the Russian context, there are sinister manifestations, but I think there are also...
you have something like that in Russia.
Too.
I think it's just slightly vulgar. I mean, you get this thing of the Turkic style of Russian neo-nationalist building going up everywhere in Moscow. This sort of Turkic style.
Yeah, you sit in Grozny,
they think it's Oriental or something, or Muscovite Orient. But as you say, it's a complete invention of a tradition which actually never existed. But it's in their minds as something different, and it appeals to the tastes of the new Russians who can afford $2 million for an apartment.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. Today in Russia, do you have say legends like Boris Pasternak, the contemporary versions of them? And if they are there, are the kind of literature, the kind of the viewpoint, the kind of perspectives, are they being marginalized? Are they being allowed? And how is the situation now? Do you have some examples?
Pasternak.
Are there examples of Pasternak?
The contemporary ones.
Of I think we answered that before, didn't we? I think we've covered that one. Yeah, I mean, there are promising and very accomplished writers on the world scene. People like Pelevin, Sarakin, and they're not writing necessarily in that tradition anymore, but they're out there and they're writing and they're to be read.
Time for one more question.
There's a young girl over here that I think had her hand up before.
Oh, right, okay, and then very quickly, the lady there in the front row, and then we'll stop. They can be quick questions, please.
We've studied a little bit of 19th century Russian literature, and there was the very prevalent debate about the Napoleonic man, the concept of the extraordinary man, which is discussed in the literature and otherwise by a lot of the great figures of Russia. So I was wondering, how did that really originate in Russia at that point, and does it still surface in literature, in contemporary Russian literature?
The extraordinary man.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, doesn't that come from Tolstoy, really? The first epic, War and Peace, in which, Kutuzov is compared with Napoleon, and Napoleon is this false character, false military strategist, because it's all based on German theories. And Kutuzov is this Russian natural genius of war, because he feels intuitively the way the battle's going, and he's in line with the passions of his soldiers. And that's the Russian way of making war.
But, I mean, he's a great man insofar as I think Tolstoy just does not buy into the idea of the great man, right? He's, by being in touch with, there's the whole famous thing about people blame the Battle of Borodino on Napoleon having a cold, but actually one person doesn't have the power to change, that a battle is about, hundreds of thousands of people doing something, and Kutuzov is kind of like tapped into that. I think the great man idea, I mean, that seems more of a Nietzschean, Dostoevskian strand in Russian literature to me. And he also, I think Crime and Punishment questions that in a more direct way than War and Peace. But, because it's so plausible, right, that there's one guy who's a little bit smarter than everyone else, doesn't have enough money. Does he get to kill some horrible person and take her money and exercise his greatness? And the answer he comes up with is no, but it's not like a fake question. It's a real question that he entertains.
Right, running out of time, so time for a very quick question,
very
quick
quick
answer.
one. How much of the culture, language, and so on of the Turkic states that were part of the Soviet Empire have become part of Russian culture, in the sense that the British language, literature, everything was considerably enriched by the connection with India?
The Turkic influence on Russia.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting
Good
question.
Yeah.
So I think the main legacy that lasts now is that the Soviets actually translated a large amount of Turkic when they were they had to kind of create nationalisms for Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and they sort of created national poets for each of them, and part of that involved suppressing nuance, and it was not a great thing for literature, but part of it involved translating and publishing and disseminating, and that was actually, and a lot of those, Alisher Navoy, who in Turkey is known as Alisher Navai and is thought to be Turkic, is considered to be the national poet of Uzbekistan, and that's something that came from, and there's still statues of him everywhere and metro stops, and he's still someone who I think Russian speakers even in Russia know about, so that's kind of an interesting.
Very quickly?
Yeah, it's something that was denied by most Russian cultural historians, but towards the end of the 19th century, a lot of archaeologists, philologists became interested in the legacies of the Mongol invasion, and of course most of the Mongols that came into Russia just stayed and intermarried. So there are a lot of names. Turgenev is a Mongol name. There's a lot of basic words for foodstuffs which are Mongol derived. People looked at it in terms of folk costumes, dance habits. All of these seem to have come from Turkic origin as far as those explorers of Russian culture were concerned. And then people like Stravinsky or the painter Rurich around the turn of the 20th century were trying to express that, the idea of Russia as a Eurasian culture, as something which had more in common with Turkic cultures than it did with Europeans. So it's something that came to the surface in Russian national ideas of itself, but is always something, I think, because Russia sees itself as essentially a European Christian culture, it was always a slightly problematic idea.
Right, well, what better way to start your Sunday morning than Russian life and Russian literature? Please thank Elif Batuman and Orlando Figes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also thank you to John Kampfner for beautifully moderating that session. Thank you, everybody. If you have any books, photographs, questions, please, our authors are going to go over to the author's signing desk behind the far pillar, just on the edge of that tree. Please allow them to go over there. So we're going to be having a very interesting session next. It's starting 5 minutes early at 11:10, and it's going to be recorded for BBC broadcast. And that's A Public Philosopher with Michael Sandel. So if you could be ready for that at 10 past, we're going to have a short break now. And thank you so much.